This episode is educationally spicy. Hi, I'm Kevin Auga DeCamp.
And I'm Trevor Disco Daddy Dow.
And this is VTV, the definitive podcast for all things LGBT travel, pop culture,
and where we share diverse perspectives from members within our community. Well, this is a very exciting episode for us, Kevin, because we're getting to do one of my favorite things in the whole wide world,
which is
dress up. I thought I would come a little subdued because I knew that you were going to come with a really crazy look. So I wanted to let you, shine.
Okay, thank you. I feel beautiful.
And you are shining because you're covered in what? Baby oil.
Yeah, I just feel like cave people back then were really shiny and sweaty from all the heat.
This is one of our favorite times of year. For people that know us, they know that we love to dress up, we love costumes, and we love to throw a party. So what are some of your favorite past Halloween looks?
Oh, like me?
What are some of your favorite things that you've ever dressed up as?
It wasn't even Halloween, but I was a dead pest control person.
Oh, that's true.
And I had a beautiful gun of toxins I would spray on my pests.
Mm-hmm. And you were a pest.
What are your favorite Halloween costumes?
I was Frankenstein, I think, when I was 6 years old, painted green, I think in regular paint, not like body paint.
This makes sense. Lead paint.
She super glued bolts to my neck. Because this is early 90s,
and they didn't know anything about children in the 90s.
I'm a huge Christina Aguilera fan. She's having a renaissance right now. She looks incredible. We'll have to talk about it at some point.
Yeah.
But when I was 9 years old, I dressed up as Christina Aguilera for Halloween.
And now look at him.
And now look at me. I loved Halloween at a very early age because my mom was so supportive. And as a queer kid, having that support at that age to kind of play around and not just feel like I have to dress up as a police officer or something very heterosexual masculine was really inspiring. And what's interesting about it being Halloween and our interview for today is I feel like going into the interview,
we were scared.
Not scared, but I feel like there's a lot of unknowns when it comes to sexual health and gay sex.
Yeah,
and
that's true. To be honest, on the summer tour, I had quite a few scares of am I doing this right? Am I broken down there?
Broken down where?
My butt.
Oh.
After my experience of bottoming,
okay,
I feel like something's different. And because I can't pinpoint it and it's confusing.
It feels scary.
I feel like I have done something incorrect, but according to Jonathan, it's all normal.
We met Jonathan on our VACAYA's first trip kind of back after COVID shut everything down. It was our P-Town Jamboree, which is kind of like a block of hotels that VACAYA had bought out, and we kind of added our own entertainment, and it was kind of like a big block party for a week. And Jonathan and his partner, Jeremy, were on that trip, and we just instantly connected and clicked with them. And since then, they've actually added a third to their relationship.
Yeah,
they're now...
they're a throuple.
We met their third while we were in New York on our tour.
Even just knowing both of them, they all just felt so relaxed.
That's how
something aspired to, really.
Yeah. We wanted to kind of talk about and deep dive? Is that the word? Yeah. Sorry, I had a brain fart. Did you see that happen in real life?
I think everyone saw that.
Oh my God. Yeah, we wanted to deep dive into sexual health. Surprise, surprise. I think probably for many, especially dressed like this, but I'm very much not a bottom, and I would love to be able to feel more comfortable with that aspect of sex. We spent quite a bit of time with Jonathan. There's just so much, and what's so incredible and wonderful about Jonathan is Jonathan's focus is not just gay men. It is the whole spectrum of identities and really what sex can look like and feel like for everybody.
And really some shocking insights that I didn't realize was the case for really everyone.
Yeah.
This episode's sexual health for everyone.
Yes. So let's get into it, and then afterwards maybe we can talk about a couple of our takeaways. While we're here in New York, we thought we would see one of the most important people you can have in your Rolodex of people to know, someone that is an expert when it comes to LGBTQ health and also some anal needs. We've got Jonathan, a wonderful, amazing PA, and Hi, Jonathan. Thanks for being with us.
Hi, happy Pride. Thank you for having me.
That's right. It is. We're here during New York Pride, and it's truly been an insane week so far. How has your Pride been?
It's wonderful. I mean, New York is just rainbows everywhere.
Yeah.
And honestly, when we see so much happening in this country, and then to walk out of my front door and like every single building's covered in rainbows, it's like we're good. We're good.
Yeah. That's a good, hopeful perspective. I love that.
Do you mind just telling our viewers and listeners kind of how you identify?
So my name is Jonathan Baker. I'm a colorectal surgery PA. And I use he, him pronouns. I identify as gay.
But we were just talking earlier, and you are kind of recently in a throuple.
Yes. I've been with my partner Jeremy for 13 years. And
wow, congratulations.
2 years ago, we met Andrew. And I've never really thought of myself as polyamorous, and have a lot of patients who are. And I always thought, like, that's so cool, but not really something I'm interested in. And then met the right person, and it clicked, and we've been together since. So it makes me so happy.
That's so exciting. And also, like, just watching the three of you interact, even for that just, a little bit that we've been hanging out earlier, like, you can see it. Yeah. And it's one of those things we were even talking about. It's like, sometimes you don't even know or realize that there's like a puzzle piece missing in the puzzle because it doesn't feel that way. And then there's a puzzle piece that's added, and you're like,
I mean, it just feels like it was just natural. Just like y'all just like really aligned.
And I always think like people tend to find their relationships when they're not looking. Like when someone's desperately looking for a partner is usually when they have the hardest time.
Totally.
And like with jobs too, right? Like when you need a job, it's hard to find. When you don't need one is like the best time to find a job. And I think that's the same thing. Like it just sort of landed where it landed, and it's been so wonderful.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome.
We met Jonathan and Jeremy a few years ago back in P-Town. That's kind of how we got introduced on VACAYA's P-Town Summer Jamboree trip. And it was an incredible experience.
So fun.
Yeah, it was I think 2021 summer. So it was like right as we had just gotten or like maybe the first rounds of vaccines for COVID had gone out. So it was like the first like, wow, we're all like back and hanging out, and then we're
what
in
does
P-Town.
being social mean? Yeah.
Yes. And
I think it was like a month later was like the big like outbreak in P-Town.
Yeah.
and like,
and it wasn't
we got
because
to
of
be there
us.
in that glorious moment where like things felt good, and we didn't know there was going to be
another
spike.
like spike. Yeah, I think it's because
That's
it was
so
like
funny.
4th of July weekend. Then, yeah, we weren't the cause of that
weren't the
spike. We weren't the spike. But yeah, the two of you were, I remember it so clearly. Like our photographer Gabriel was with us on that trip, and he instantly was like, those two boys, like, I had to photograph them. Look at how cute, look at how sweet they are. Okay, well, now we're just like a little pod that's hanging out for the rest of the week, and it was amazing.
And we were like two puzzle pieces that fit perfectly together. And funny, that's like one of our analogies we've always used. So it's funny that like you bring that up as the throuple, because it really is like that.
I have a lot of questions. Let me just.
I have a lot of answers. So.
Okay, thank you. This is why I feel so lucky today, is because I am traditionally someone who tops. And so one of the reasons is because I don't think I know enough down there to really feel comfortable. So I feel lucky that we get to ask, you some questions about maybe what's causing those types of hesitations.
Absolutely.
Okay.
I mean, it is a part of your body that, first of all, like everyone tries to cover up from the minute you're born. And then as a child, it's like considered dirty and like private, and no one wants to talk about it. So you stigmatize that part of your body for 20 years, and then all of a sudden, like, oh, this is a sex organ. Like it's a huge like change of the way you think of yourself.
Yeah. I have a lot of fear when it comes to that, which is why I don't bottom typically, and I would like to. I view women in bottoms as like gods on earth or goddesses on earth because
Agreed.
because truly like they hold the power, you know, like the top's mindset is like, oh yeah, like I'm powerful, but truly it's like, no, the bottom and the woman, they're the ones that are calling the shots and making it happen, and like they have the gift. So I think it's like a really what?
Okay, it sounds like you're writing a religious text, and this is like the Bible of it.
I mean, I worship women and I worship bottoms. So yeah,
Great.
I guess it can be a religious experience.
Great.
Well, what are some of your concerns, Kevin?
Just this is great. This is your religion, and I support you in your cult leading activities.
I'm about to be a convert, so
Yeah.
Hey, come join. Did you always have an interest in specializing in LGBTQ plus health when it came to like getting into the medical field?
I really didn't. I've been an advocate for my whole life, and very much have put myself in any space that I can to advocate for LGBTQ people. But it was never really my plan to be like in this professionally. And my first rotation in school was gynecology, and I was like horrified. Like I have never seen a vagina. I've never wanted to see a vagina, and I'm going to now spend 8 weeks looking at vaginas. And everyone was like, it'll be fine. Like you're going to see babies be born. That's so amazing. And it is amazing to see a baby be born. But my favorite part was sexual health. I was like, this is so cool, helping people enjoy something that's so innate to the human experience. And when something goes wrong, be able to fix that. And so I really found a huge passion in that. And then very luckily sort of landed into the field that I've ended up in to get to explore sexual health with a primarily LGBTQ population, but not always. I have plenty of patients in all walks of life.
Yeah.
And I feel very passionate that anal sex is something that that our bodies are actually designed for. And you'll never hear any other healthcare professional say that, although I hope you do in the future. But it's so interesting how much is happening in this little space, right? So the skin around the anus has a ton of nerves, and the only place that has more like sensory nerves to experience pleasure is the genitals. Right. But the anus is like number 2. So much sensory pleasure. And I would equate it to like the nipples or like the ear, like places that are sort of very sexual
Sensitive.
in nature without being genitals. And in people with a prostate, the prostate gets like all this credit for anal sex. And it should, because it's a huge pleasure zone. But there's actually an aspect of the penis that sits right up against the rectal wall. And so the penis is actually directly stimulated during anal sex. And then in people without a prostate, without a penis, who have clitoris, the clitoris actually has these nerve branches that wrap back around the anus. And so the clitoris is stimulated during anal sex. And then in people with a clitoris, there's this Skene's gland, which variably in the research is sometimes called the G-spot.
Oh, sure.
And it's a spot sort of right between the rectum and the anus. And so you're actually like stimulating all of this stuff. And the more that I think about it and learn about it and research, the more I'm like, wow, our butts were designed for sex. And so intelligently. And so, and you think about like heterosexual people who I've met some of, think about pregnancy when they have sex. And it's like, we have this gift of this place to have sex where you don't have to worry about pregnancy. How beautiful is that?
Totally. Do you think a lot of people with clitorises and vaginas know that? Do you think that that's like a common... Because to me, that seems like I've never once... And I've got a lot of girlfriends, and I hope all the girlfriends are watching this episode because like...
Brag.
I mean, I'm lucky. That's why maybe it's because I worship women. That's why I have so many. I'm lucky enough to have so many female friends. That's great. That needs to be yelled from the rooftops then.
Yeah. And so many women often have sort of unsatisfying sex because people don't know how to navigate their genitals.
Yeah.
And I think it's sort of funny that like there's this whole other section of their genitals they don't even know about. But it is actually fairly common. About a third of heterosexual people have anal sex.
Okay.
And and not a lot of people are talking about it.
Yeah.
But the women that do talk about it, or anyone who has a clitoris, really describes this like orgasm during anal sex as completely different and like mind-blowingly different from the orgasm during vaginal sex. And it's like, who even knew that was on the menu?
Yeah, right.
That blows my mind. I'm gonna have to process that.
I'm gonna have to prostate that. That was bad. It was stupid.
We're gonna cut that.
Okay, yeah. He's not gonna cut it. He's gonna leave it to make me look like a ding dong. This interview and this discussion about anal activity and anal sex and anal health is much more for the whole spectrum of people. Then it's
for
not just
everyone.
I feel like gay sex is always affiliated with anal sex as opposed to just allowing anal sex to be
Universal.
a universal experience. Yeah.
And I also think it's really important that we uncouple that, right? Because there's a lot of gay people who don't like anal sex, and that's okay. Like, there's nothing wrong with that. Like, oral sex is fun, cuddling's fun.
Yes.
If you're if you're asexual, like there's so much variation in here that like to couple gay sex and anal sex also it is almost like stigmatizing.
Yeah. Oh, for sure.
Between people who have like vaginas and penises, their anal glands are stimulated in a pleasurable way when being rimmed, I imagine.
I think the rimming sort of starts with an understanding of what's happening from a pleasure sense. And what you're really stimulating is a bunch of nerves that are around the anus and at the anal opening. And some of those nerves are sort of like extensions of the genitals. But separating that from like, you're not trying to necessarily like hit someone's prostate when you're rimming them, right? And so you're sort of stimulating something else. And sometimes I think people don't realize that like just external stimulation is like a lovely thing. And I do actually find that a lot of my patients who very specifically are insertive partners or tops actually really enjoy rimming.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Yep.
Oh yeah.
It took me a long time to recognize how common that is. And I bring that up partially because all STIs can transmit through oral sex. And so a lot of times, like people are like, we don't need to swab my butt. Like I don't have anal sex. But like if you have a mouth down there, yeah, we do need to swab your butt, right?
Yes.
And people don't realize that. And that's like one of those things that like I would love everyone to just like take home that lesson.
Let's say it again No, truly say it again for the people in the back.
Yeah. So oral sex spreads STIs. Or can spread STIs. And so it's really important to get checked wherever you're playing. And even if that playing is just a tongue on your anus for a couple seconds, it's still important that you get checked there.
Yeah.
Great. Very important. Very great.
The sort of biggest thing that we think about in terms of discomfort with anal sex, assuming that there's not a pathology there, like if there's a fissure or hemorrhoids, like that's going to be an issue. But in someone who doesn't have those things, then we really focus a lot on the sphincter muscle, which is the
outer
muscle at the opening of the anus. And it's really like a cuff that is maybe like an inch deep from the surface, like internally.
Okay.
And it has two components, the inner and the external.
Okay.
And they're inner and external to themselves, not to the body. So it's like sort of one cuff and then around it another cuff.
Wow.
The inner cuff is involuntary muscle, so similar to what our heart's made out of. So it just does what it's going to do and your brain cannot control it. And then you have the external sphincter, so the outer cuff that's wrapping around the internal sphincter, which you do control. So it's like your bicep. Like you can fully, if you like clench your butt right now, you're clenching your external sphincter. And so if you're having sex and you want something in your anus, you can say, external sphincter, please relax, and it will do that for you. But your internal sphincter will not. It's going to just like do its own thing. And if your internal sphincter has only been one way for 20, 30 years, it's going to be kind of confused when you're trying to use it in the opposite direction.
That is crazy.
Right? So I love to compare it to heart muscle because it actually responds in a really similar way. So if you think about like if you're anxious, if you're nervous, if you're uncomfortable, your heart's racing, your sphincter's also like clenching. If you're relaxed, if you feel comfortable, if you feel safe, then your internal sphincter will relax and your heart will relax.
So it's just
heart rate goes
involuntary,
down.
like it's truly a mind thing. It's attributing its releasing towards.
Yeah, so you're like stimulating a nerve path when you're relaxed that lets parts of your body relax.
Whoa.
Yeah. So if you're like, I always have pain with sex, right? Your brain's immediately gonna be like, clamp down. And I think that's where a lot of people really struggle with it. And so one of the best ways of like learning your sphincter is to spend time on your own and like make your anus a sexual organ to yourself.
But would you attribute that to relaxing? Like knowing how to relax in general?
Yes, relaxing in general is super helpful.
I don't know how to do
Yeah,
that.
I was just gonna say.
So this is all adding
maybe we
up.
can. Maybe we should also do an episode on how to relax, so you then can learn how to relax your hole.
I truly sometimes recommend like mindfulness and meditation practices to my patients.
That is so fascinating.
Relax their anus.
For the children that don't know, just go into like hemorrhoids and anal fissures just to kind of touch base on what those are and kind of
too.
You know,
and how to avoid them.
Yes.
Yeah.
So both hemorrhoids and fissures are caused by sort of similar processes where your bowel movements are not doing what they should do. And so hemorrhoids are the blood vessels around the anus and rectum. There's like a whole network of blood vessels that wrap all the way around. And we all have them. And during bowel movements, they purposely swell up and kind of give like a cushion so that your bowel movement doesn't like rip your sphincter open. So you have like this little hemorrhoid cushion there, but you can push and strain and push blood into those vessels and then they swell. When they're external, they sort of swell in your skin and they can be painful and sometimes cause a bump that you feel. Internally, they're in a place where you don't have a whole lot of pain sensation, so they're usually not painful, but they're under this really thin intestinal skin that bleeds easily. And most people get a little bit of both. And so you may get like some bleeding from the inside and some pain from the more external aspect, which are the same symptoms that people get with fissures. And a fissure is just a little cut at the opening of the anus. There's basically a sort of fragile or sensitive part of the anus, one towards the tailbone, one towards the perineum or taint, where the skin can tear really, really easily. Generally, like less wiping is better.
And what about wet wipes? Are those bad for? Because I hear
bad.
Okay, that's a myth. That's something that like it's truly like.
Are you listening?
That's why I'm asking.
Yeah, they are bad. So there's two things that happen with wet wipes. One that definitely happens is you have all of these chemicals in them so that they have like a 2-year shelf life. And I love preservatives. Like, don't get me wrong. Like I am like so not like in that mindset of like avoiding preservatives, but your butt does not like them. Right. And so many people have a sensitivity to wet wipes, but it's a really slow sensitivity. And so you use them for like a month and then you start to feel discomfort from it. But meanwhile, that whole time there was like some irritation happening. And even an occasional use can be like pretty irritating. And then there's some concern that I think we probably need better research on it and how it affects like the normal bacteria on the skin. And that normal bacteria keeps everything happy, and when you remove it, you have the opportunity for like bad bacteria to come in and cause like an infection or an irritation. So definitely avoid the wet wipes.
I'm throwing them out when I get back to the hotel room. What about a bidet?
I love a bidet.
So bidet, wipes, goodbye.
Yep. And bidets are like bidet attachments for the toilet have become so easy to obtain
and
like,
affordable. Yeah.
Kevin has
so
one.
cheap.
He loves it.
I've installed 100 of that's a lie, but I've literally probably installed like 5 of them because anywhere I move like is immediately getting bidet. The one issue is they can be stronger than they need to be. And so people are like, power washing their anus, which we don't need to do. So when it comes to cleaning up before sex, we have, in my continued process of like our bodies were made for anal sex, we have basically this like 10-inch landing strip in the rectum that in a perfect situation, there would be no stool in there ever.
Okay.
And then there's like the sharp kink called the rectosigmoid junction.
Okay.
I'll only say that once.
Yeah.
Past that sharp kink, your stool like sort of sits there. And then when you're ready to have a bowel movement, that kink opens up, the stool comes into the rectum. There's actually a reflex that happens that tells you it's time to poop. And your sphincter relaxes, and your hemorrhoids swell up a little bit to give you your cushions.
Wow.
And all of that happens. But when that's not happening, you have this like 10-inch landing strip. And the reality is the average penis is just under 6 inches, right? So we can all dream, but the majority of the time,
I love a good under 6. So
100%.
yeah, it's
and under 6 is more than enough to stimulate all of the things.
But that's so. Just to circle that, when you're saying 10-inch landing strip, is that just the majority of everybody's? No matter your height, the way that kind of
develops
cavity is built is designed to have that ample amount of space.
Yeah, and it varies from person to person. And some people it's shorter, and some people it's longer.
Yeah.
I suspect in the people who like get into bottoming very, very easily, like their anatomy is probably in one direction, and the people who struggle with it more probably like have a slightly different anatomy.
But everybody does have a space where that is something that can be played with.
Yeah. So most healthcare professionals are like, do not douche, it's bad for you. My take is less is more, and the fiber is super helpful in keeping the stool back behind the rectosigmoid junction, which I'll say again, I'm so sorry. That little kink that's past your 10-inch landing strip is really helpful for that. And then if you need to use a little bit of water to sort of clean out that 10-inch landing strip, that's okay. But less is more. And what you don't want to do is put too much liquid in there that is actually passing the rectosigmoid junction, that kink, and dislodging stool that wasn't going to be a problem in the first place. And everyone who bottoms regularly has had the experience where you're douching, it's clean, and then all of a sudden it's not. And that's because you've over-douched and you've gone past
to that junction, that junction spot.
And so really like half of a cup to a cup of water is enough. You don't need to like do inversions or like shake or bounce or jump. Like just let it be there.
Okay.
Kevin, you don't have to shake and bounce no mo.
All right, great.
You can, but do it separate from your douching.
Yeah, Trevor, don't rain on my parade like that.
Sorry.
Do you have any tips on fingering the anus?
I do. So when it comes to fingering the anus, I think an understanding again first, like what are you stimulating is really helpful. So, just rubbing a finger around the anus can be really pleasurable for those nerves at the anal opening. You might be stimulating some of those sort of genital nerves that are there. And again, like you don't need to like dive in and jam your finger onto the prostate. Like that's not necessarily going to be the thing that's super pleasurable. And it can actually be really uncomfortable to have a finger jammed onto your prostate. And then also recognizing the way the sphincters are reacting, right? So if you let the internal sphincter, the involuntary component, the one like your heart muscle, relax, then your finger can go in really gently. If you put your finger there and jam it in right away, that internal sphincter is like, no. And so much so we actually have a reflex that I love to talk about just because it's called the anal wink. Where as soon as you touch someone's anus, their sphincter immediately clenches down. And even people who like bottom regularly, that still happens because it's a reflex. Like when your healthcare provider hits your knee with a hammer, your knee kicks, right? Yes. Your butt does that. And so anytime you're like putting something in an anus, whether it's a finger or a penis or a strap-on or whatever, you want to give it like a couple seconds to anal wink. And then it'll open up and then you can sort of put a finger in. From there, you're still stimulating a ton of stuff. So like you don't need to dive and like poke at the prostate over and over and over. But you can like stimulate it. But you're also, the Skene's gland and people with a clitoris, the G spot is right there too. So that sort of direction towards the genitals is can be really stimulating, but you might
even
also
for
give it a
men
rest.
too?
Even for men, yep.
Like if you angle, you're saying, towards the genitals?
Yeah, so the prostate sits between the rectum and the genitals. So in the front, you're going to sort
Wow.
of stimulate the prostate, but again, you don't want to like overstimulate it. So like a smooth sort of massaging, but not necessarily like when we think about sex as this sort of in and out thing, like that's not necessarily good for the prostate.
Okay. Do you suggest lube or some type of lubricant?
Absolutely. And
Absolutely.
cut that, please.
I'm cutting. Yeah, thank you.
There's a word there, absolutely. That's not absolutely.
You
You
can-
can splice the video with him
Yeah.
out of it.
You know, it's possible to just like think about things before you say them.
Well, then that wouldn't be any fun. Okay, sorry. Keep going.
So the vagina is self-lubricating. The mouth is self-lubricating. The anus is generally not, although there's a little bit of an exception to that. So generally, you're going to need some kind of lubrication for insertion into the anus. But I would actually encourage to use it even in advance, right? If you're like rubbing a dry finger on a dry anus, like that's going to be a lot of friction, and so you can really like using some lube just for like fingering and that sort of thing. It can be really lovely and like reduce the discomfort that might occur with friction.
And probably incur some relaxation to get that internal sphincter relaxed.
Exactly.
I love learning. You're helping.
So lubes fall into 3 general categories. There's water-based lubes, which are like your very typical like KY jelly, sort of the thing everyone knows. And they're okay. They tend to dry out fairly quickly. So when you use them in a vagina and there's self-lubrication happening, they tend to be enough. In the anus, where there's no self-lubrication happening, they'll dry out. So as long as you reapply. And then there are silicone-based lubes that last a lot longer. So silicone's like what's used in cars. So they like go 100,000 miles, right? So a silicone lube's going to take you far.
Take you far.
The problem with them, though, sometimes is people end up trying to wipe it off of their skin after.
Okay.
And because it basically never feels like it's off, people just like keep wiping and wiping and wiping and cause irritation. And then the third type of lube is oil-based.
Okay.
And there's very few commercial oil-based lubes. I think Boy Butter is the only one that like comes to mind. And the big reason for that is they're not compatible with latex condoms. They break down latex condoms.
Okay.
But if we face the reality that condoms are not used more than they're used, both now and prior to PrEP, the reality is that oil-based lubes can be a really wonderful thing if you're in that moment not using a condom. And a lot of like household things are used, like coconut oil or Vaseline. And we don't have enough data for me to like say that's totally safe, but I also don't see people having problems from it. So
You don't have people coming in that have inflammation or something because they use coconut oil as a lube per se?
yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And those last a long time, and they're probably like good for the skin. So any of them are fine, but just recognizing like what the differences are. I generally recommend a silicone-based lube.
Okay.
Um,
If you're going to do something, it's maybe shower it off.
Yeah, how would you then recommend?
or you just let it kind of dissipate.
just let it be.
Just have a little slide in between, as you walk down. Did that lube your fancy?
Yeah, I did. Yeah. And what came to mind too was like, I know I've used like coconut oil before, and it's just sometimes it just like stains the sheets because it's oil. So it's like, so then I think about that aspect of it too, is like cleanup and how.
Silicone lube can stain sheets too.
Yeah,
so
you're
like,
right.
if you're
Just
worried
put a
about that,
towel
like
down.
water-based is the way to go. It'll wash out anything easily. But just make sure you like refresh it or put a towel down and use whatever you want.
Yeah.
What is PrEP? What's Doxy PEP? And do you think there's any other kind of medicines down the pipeline that you think could potentially be coming out?
Yes, there is so much potentially coming out. So PrEP is the use of a medication to prevent HIV transmission to someone who does not currently have HIV. And the medications are the same medications that people with HIV take. And in people with HIV who take those medications, generally it suppresses the virus to a point that we can't detect it in the blood. And at that point, they cannot sexually transmit HIV.
Let's say that a little bit louder again for people.
So undetectable means people cannot sexually transmit HIV. In medicine, there are almost no times I can think of where we say something is 100%.
Yeah.
That is the exception. 100% cannot
Wow.
sexually transmit HIV.
Wow.
And so I actually believe that the quote unquote safest sex that you can have, if we're worried about transmitting HIV, is someone who's HIV negative on PrEP, and someone who has an undetectable viral load. There is zero risk of HIV transmission. PrEP is slightly less than 100%, but
Sure.
pretty close. And I'm not a statistician, but there's about 500,000 people in the US on PrEP.
Wow.
It became first approved in 2012. And we know of, we being the royal we of all of medicine, know of like 6 or 7 cases where it's failed.
Wow.
And these are cases where there
Whoa.
was detectable drug in the person's body. So they were definitely taking it to some extent. 6 or 7 cases out of 500,000 people
Yeah.
over a decade.
Wow.
Like,
Incredible.
pretty incredible. And we know that people are going to orgies and taking load after load after load and not getting HIV. Like PrEP has been tested in the real world so extensively.
Yeah.
And people continue to be negative on it. So incredibly effective.
Wow.
Yeah.
Incredible.
And I want to, and people hate me for this, but I want to pit it against condoms,
Okay.
where the data says that people who consistently use condoms are 80% less likely to acquire HIV than people who inconsistently or never use condoms. 80% is a whole lot lower than what I just talked about.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So condoms are lovely for contraception. Condoms are lovely for STI prevention. They're lovely for HIV transmission prevention. But the reality is that they're just not used that frequently, and they're just not as effective as other methods that we have specifically.
PrEP.
No. Yeah.
The great thing about them is they prevent all of those things at once, right? So you prevent
Sure.
like HIV, gonorrhea, chlamydia, and pregnancy all in in one fall swoop, and that's a wonderful thing. Like if you had a pill that did that, people would be crazy about it.
Right.
But there's also so many exceptions, and there's so many skin-to-skin transmission diseases like human papillomavirus, herpes, mpox, formerly known as monkeypox. All of those things are skin-to-skin transmission, and so you're not covering all the skin with a condom.
Yeah.
And so there's just so many exceptions to them. They're a wonderful thing. There is a time and place for them, but the reality is that PrEP works better than condoms.
And can you talk about Doxy PEP too?
Yeah.
That kind of beautiful thing.
Doxy PEP is a beautiful thing.
Is it? Are you saying it's a PEP
Yep.
or PrEP?
So it's PEP because you're using it
Post.
after.
Yeah.
You learn something new every day.
So PrEP is pre-exposure, and PEP is post-exposure.
Wow. Okay.
And there's actually post-exposure for HIV transmission as well.
Yeah.
And we'll never have good data on that. You can't do a clinical trial with a placebo
Right.
of PEP, right? It's
Right.
not ethical.
That's true.
So we'll never really know how well it works. It definitely fails in cases, and we know that for a fact. And so PrEP is definitely more effective. PEP also can be used up to 72 hours. But in reality, like I want my patient to take it as soon as humanly possible. So like don't wait, go to urgent care. And I literally tell the patient, I'm like, go to the pharmacy, buy a bottle of water, take your first 2 pills, like standing in the pharmacy. Like I want that drug in your body as soon as possible.
Really?
And that's for Doxy PEP.
That is
Or it's
for HIV PEP.
HIV PEP. Okay. And so for Doxy PEP, what is that one?
Is it
what
the
is
same urgency?
So not as much. So Doxy PEP is also as soon as possible within 24 to 72 hours of sex. After 72 hours, it's too late.
Okay.
And the idea is having a small amount of the right drug in the right place at the right time to sort of abort an infection that could have happened.
Okay.
And so what we do is you take 2 pills after sex, and the goal is to prevent that chlamydia infection that would have required a week or 3 weeks of Doxy, or the gonorrhea infection that would have used a much stronger antibiotic.
Wow.
So it's not a matter of like people using antibiotics that don't need them. It's people who were going to have to use an antibiotic at some point in time.
Strategically
And then they're
using them.
getting to use a smaller amount so that you then...
Exactly. And Doxy in particular, we don't see a lot of resistance in bacteria to Doxy as opposed to like azithromycin that we previously used to treat chlamydia. And we no longer do because of the resistance patterns that developed.
Oh,
really?
so that was a concern, right? At one point, resistance to the
drug.
effectiveness.
Yeah. So azithromycin used, or a Z-Pak basically, although slightly different dose, used to be the treatment for chlamydia. And then in 2021, the CDC came out like red alert, like do not use this any longer. They're now 5% of chlamydia is resistant to azithromycin. And that's the point where it just spirals.
Whoa. And then when it comes to Doxy, is there, you said between the 24, 72 hour window, and for people who are more sexually active, is there a certain amount of Doxy PEP that you should be limiting yourself to be taking, since it is like an antibiotic? Is it an antibiotic?
Yep.
Okay.
That is the question that I don't think anyone has the answer to.
Okay.
The recommendation currently is to not use more than 1 dose a day, so 2 pills.
Sure.
But I also don't know that I want people taking 2 pills of Doxy a day. I have a hard time with conceptualizing this in someone who's having potential exposures multiple times a week, where it's like, where do you start and stop? How do you be judicious with it? There was a little bit of data that looked at just taking 1 pill once a day. And I think the more we learn about that, the better, because I think that might be a better solution than 2 pills once a day.
Yeah.
But again, it's like if we're using Doxy rather than, looking at gonorrhea becoming resistant to the only antibiotic used for it, which is an injection, like I would much prefer to abort that infection, even if that person's on Doxy daily. And we use Doxy daily for prevention of acne, like for 3 months before someone's wedding. Like, I don't know why we like suddenly Doxy resistance is a concern when it has to do with sex, but when it's for your wedding photos, that's fine. Leave it to the US.
Right. Yeah. Right. Do you see that there's any push or any consequences even of PrEP only being kind of geared towards gay men?
Heterosexual people are definitely getting lost in the shuffle of HIV. So gay men represent about 2/3 of HIV transmissions which occur. And there's still like around 30,000 HIV transmissions that occur in the US every year, which is a lot.
Wow.
And it's a lot when we have all of the tools we need to prevent it. And there's a few groups that are getting lost. One is heterosexual people, because they just, like I just mentioned, it's not really like on their periphery. Like they
their
don't
radar.
think about it. And their providers don't think about it. Even though the CDC has recommended HIV testing being like routine part of any medical care for decades now, and it's just not being done. Like if you go get your annual physical and you get blood work done, HIV should just be part of that. And it should be part of that for people who are married and monogamous or think they're monogamous, because those are some of the most devastating cases when you don't realize this is happening until your immune system has been absolutely decimated. And maybe it was a drunk work trip or like whatever, but like shit happens. And so it really should be a routine part. The other group that's really missing out is people of color. We know that almost like 90% of white gay men who should be on PrEP are on PrEP. And the rates for Black gay men is in the teens. Like, what is that? And it has to do with so many things. It has to do with institutional racism. It has to do with barriers to care. It has to do with the trauma of clinical research that's been done in really horrible ways for certain communities. There's been a lot of increases in HIV among people of Latin descent, and transgender women as well, who are taking the brunt of the HIV epidemic currently, and who aren't getting prescribed PrEP And a big part of that is their concern that it's going to interfere with their hormones. And the reality is that it does not. There's some interaction there where it can decrease the amount of PrEP. So it's really important that it's taken daily and consistently, but it doesn't lower the amount of hormones. But that is such a real fear. The thing that we can do as white, cis, gay men is to really fight this transphobia that's happening in our own community that I don't recall 5 years ago. I don't remember that being a thing. And the frequency with which I'm seeing and hearing things that are like, T is not part of our community. Trans is not, like, we are a different thing. I don't want to be associated with that. It is so harmful, especially when trans people led...
Okay.
Especially when trans people literally led the movements that we are now enjoying all of the benefits of, and we're enjoying those benefits and having access to PrEP and having access to healthcare and having access to marriage and having access to housing, to having access to jobs. And the very people who got us that, so much of our community is turning against right now. And I can't even, I have such a hard time imagining what that's like. Like, all of society is turning, and then to see the people who should be your allies the most turning is just, it's painful.
It's painful. It's disgusting. And I'm glad you shared that, because that's something we need to change.
Are there any symptoms or things that people could look out for, or that they might notice if they've, kind of contracted something from oral anal sex?
A couple of things to think about with oral anal sex and STIs. First of all, again, oral sex will transmit all of the stuff, whether it's on an anus or a penis or a vagina or whatever. So you have your risks of like gonorrhea and chlamydia and syphilis. You have all the skin-to-skin stuff, the HPVs, the herpes, the Mpox. But oral anal sex in particular, you can pass diseases that pass through a oral fecal route, meaning something that passes from the stool into the mouth. And when we think about that, we might think about like contaminated food. You've probably seen like a hepatitis scare with contaminated food. And that's because the hepatitis is in animals that poop onto the food. It gets clean, but not all the virus comes off. And so that actually happens with humans too. So hepatitis A in particular. And I wanted to start with hepatitis A because it's something that is routinely vaccinated for with a really effective, safe vaccine, but it wasn't recommended for us when we were kids.
Right.
It is often used for travel. And so anyone over the age of probably 20 might not have had this very readily available vaccine that should be free, is super safe, very effective. And so especially if you're having sex involving the anus, and even if licking a butt's not your thing, like things get places and there's bodily fluids and the lights might not be on, like who knows what you touched and then touched your mouth. Like if the anus is at all part of your sex life, definitely make sure you're vaccinated for Hep A.
Oh my gosh, I had no idea. I'm gonna have to check my records.
And then the other is the sexually transmitted enteric infections, which are bacteria and viruses that live in the GI tract and generally cause like stomach or abdominal or bowel issues. And there's a whole bunch of them. Probably the most common that we think about with rimming or oral anal sex is Giardia, which is an organism that is passed through like oral fecal route. And Giardia and all of the other ones, including Shigella, which is another really common, they can range from having no symptoms to having a ton of symptoms. And the ton of symptoms is really, really, really unpleasant.
It's awful.
Yeah.
It's
Did you have it?
yeah. It's one of the worst experiences of my life for sure.
Yeah. And some people get it and have no symptoms. And the importance of that is that that person can then spread it to you and they have no symptoms and you all of a sudden do. And they had no idea.
Yeah.
And those symptoms, when they do happen, can be like really bad diarrhea. Bloating's a really hallmark symptom of these infections, abdominal pain and cramping, and that cramping can be absolutely excruciating. But for most people who get it, it's really kind of minor. And Shigella doesn't necessarily need to be treated with like antibiotics, though it can be.
Just passed.
Giardia typically does need to be treated with antibiotics. And then there's a whole bunch of other organisms that happen. Giardia is the most common. Shigella, there's been like recent outbreaks. So that's sort of on the radar a bit more, but there are others as well.
I have one last item I would like to ask you.
Yeah.
And that is the concept of a Prince Albert piercing.
Yeah.
Somebody I had a bottom for had a Prince Albert. And
You bottomed for.
someone I bottomed for, yeah. And it wasn't like a thin, it was like a gauged thick thing, metal that was inserted with the penis. And I enjoyed it. It took a minute. What?
No, I just like the trying to formulate the sentence.
What are your thoughts on, like, is there anything to be concerned about if you are in this position, like, with someone who has a Prince Albert piercing?
No, in general. So a Prince Albert is a piercing that goes through the frenulum of the penis, it's called. So the part where if the penis was erect, it would be facing forward, which is a super sensitive part of the penis.
Really?
So it goes through that, and then it goes through the urethra, the opening of the penis. And usually is like a ring shape piercing that has a ball that detaches from it. And if you've ever held in your hand a piercing like that, removing that ball is really, really hard to do. You have to like put both thumbs on it and press it. And then otherwise it's like a complete circle and there's not really any like sharp edges or anything on it. And so theoretically in a rectum, it's really not going to cause any issues, and your rectum is not going to put the pressure on there to dislodge that ball. I imagine it's happened at some point in time in the world. But not something that I've ever heard of an actual story happening. So I don't think there's actually any issue with it. I think for the insertive partner with the Prince Albert, the thing that makes it exciting is that the metal changes temperature in a different way than your body does. And so you have the super sensitive part of the penis that's being stimulated by changes in temperature in a way that is not normally happening. I think for the receptive partner, you probably wouldn't actually feel any difference from it. And largely because it's sort of like at the tip of the penis and it's narrower than the penis. There's piercings called the Jacob's ladder, which is like the other direction.
Yeah.
So I don't even know how to describe this, like
it's
side
like
to side.
Yeah.
Where you would have like a little bit of like a thicker part of the penis. I don't think that's going to make any significant difference either.
Okay.
But that coming in and out of the sphincter, when the sphincter is sort of round and you're sort of putting it's not quite a square shape into a round hole, but like I could see that being more of an issue.
Yeah.
But also not something that I've encountered as I think that's actually more common in heterosexual people than
Oh, fascinating.
Jacob's ladder?
Yeah.
I've never even climbed Jacob's ladder.
I have some kind of weird relationship with my anus or sphincter in which I kind of manifest a problem. And I've actually talked to you about this before because it happened again this past week where I was like, I've destroyed my sphincter. And I went to a doctor and just was like, can you tell me if I'm destroyed down there? And he's like, there's nothing wrong.
Yeah.
So I just think that's fascinating how, at least in my experience, I have manifested this reality that somehow like irreversed damage down there.
And people manifest that all the time. Like that is not an uncommon experience. And I guarantee you have a friend who's done the same thing, but maybe won't talk about it openly.
Sure. Or on a podcast.
And the reality is, people get two fists in their anus and their sphincter is not destroyed by that. And we do surgeries where we cut through someone's sphincter, and their anus is not destroyed from that. So I like to share those examples because it's like having sex or getting fingers is like, you could absolutely get a fissure. You could absolutely irritate things. Like, things can go wrong. I don't want to downplay that. But like, irreversible damage to the sphincter is really unlikely. Another thing, and I may even suggest that you think about it, is there's a whole field of pelvic physical therapy. And they're physical therapists, like if you had something wrong with your knee, like they would give you exercises to do. The sphincter muscle is part of our pelvic floor, which are all of these muscles that attach the bladder, the rectum, the bones of the pelvis, and they all connect to each other. And when one is off, others can be off. And I talked a little bit about like the reflexes in the anus, the sort of involuntary things that happen, those can be off. And so a pelvic floor physical therapist can actually like identify if your sphincter muscle is not functioning correctly, and then give you exercises to train it.
Well, thank you so much for spending time with us. Truly, like,
you're an angel.
Yeah, I feel like you should be teaching courses on this for the people who are, curious to learn more and continue their education and exploration. Where can they find you online? And if they are in New York, where can they potentially see you for
Schedule an appointment?
Yeah.
So my social media handle is Rectal Rockstar. There's no numbers on it because no one else took it first.
They're lost. Your gain.
I check that periodically. I'm like, is anyone else using something? No one else is. Like, it's very easy to find. And through there, I use my Instagram as sort of like my primary platform for resources.
It's incredible.
And so whatever is available is there. I'm developing a couple of different things right now. I'm not entirely sure where they're all going to go, but to do a little more sort of public education.
Yeah. I've learned so much.
Yeah, I've learned so much too.
Yeah.
Thank
so
you.
very, very grateful for your sharing.
Absolutely. I'm so glad to do this. Thank you for having me.
Well, make sure you follow the Rectal Rockstar, Mr. Jonathan Baker, and you can catch us on the next episode where we will be taking Kevin to a pelvic physical therapist. So maybe we should do a whole episode on ways to relax.
I learned a lot from that episode.
Oh, there it is. I was wondering where that bone went. I definitely feel like a light bulb went off in my head of like, oh, well, maybe why I don't feel comfortable bottoming is trust and connection. I feel like I identify a little bit more as like demisexual as opposed to pansexual.
And can you define what demisexual is compared to pansexual?
So pansexuality is a attraction to anybody, no matter the gender. So it doesn't matter if they're a boy, a girl, non-binary, somewhere in between, what parts they have. Whereas demisexual is it's hard for you to establish a sexual connection with someone unless you have an emotional trust or intimacy. Bottoming is then an extra hurdle. And I think like for me, especially in, very populated gay spaces, it's inherently, especially when it's men, inherently sexual. And that's why sometimes I think I get a little uncomfortable because I just don't know. My brain just doesn't
You don't go
operate
to
that way.
100 like everyone else can.
Sexually. But like, I don't know, talk about your history and trauma and yada, yada, yada. Like, yeah, let's go.
Yeah, that sounds so hot.
I'm sure on a future episode, we'll probably talk about all the different kinds of sexualities. For so long, we've had to stick to X, Y, and Z. And now there's the option to kind of not have to sector yourself even further.
Yeah, maybe we're getting to the point where it's just like all fluid and we're all just kind of slowly acknowledging that. It doesn't really matter, but it matters right now.
Sure.
So it's good to communicate about those things.
So it's a very educational episode and experience, and I'm glad that I got to experience it with you because I feel like we both learned so much.
Yeah, we both learned a lot.
And next episode is really interesting and fun. We talk with an entertainer of ours for on VACAYA trips, and they are just phenomenal, and I cannot wait for you to hear the interview. It covers so many different topics, and they're just so special.
Also, if you learned something from this episode, please
Now I'm going to do a slow zoom on your face and put a bunch of like sounds where it's like you're combusting. DM me.